It was quite a trip, and I can understand it would take a lot out of somebody. We had over 20 different meetings with different folks. There were 15,000 different youth from, I think, somewhere between 83 and 100 countries around the world who attended the festival. It was quite a big gathering. So, I want to start out by saying that we're Marxists. We see the world in terms of classes. We talk about, there's a very, very small group of people who own the banks, the factories, the land, the oil wells, the natural resources. We call them the capitalists. And then there's everybody else. There's the rest of us who have nothing to sell but our labor power. And in order to survive, we have to sell our labor to a capitalist in order to survive. And that the way capitalism has developed, it's gotten to the point that, the capitalists in the United States, the capitalists in Britain, capitalists in France, Germany, other Western countries, they don't just exploit the workers of their own country. They exploit the workers of the entire world. And from the labor of the workers of the entire world, they make super profits. They don't just make profits, they make super profits. And that the workers in the oppressed and colonized countries of the world, they not only are they exploited, but they're super exploited. Their conditions are far worse than what is faced by workers. And this international global setup is not just capitalism, it's the setup called imperialism. And that's what capitalism has become in the modern time. But all of us who went, Bao Han from Los Angeles, Colleen from Baltimore, Danielle and Andy from North Carolina, and myself, we already knew that. That's what we knew. We took that with us. But what we learned while we were at the World Festival of Youth and Students is that this international setup, this order called imperialism, is being challenged. There is a global movement of people all over the world who are rising up against it. And it's a very, very exciting time that we're living in. Things are changing, and we saw it firsthand. We witnessed it. We didn't just hear talks about it. We didn't just read about it. We witnessed that imperialism is under great threat and the people of the world are in motion. Now, because of unique circumstances in my life, I was actually able to visit Ecuador about 13 years ago when I was 12 years old. I was able to visit Ecuador, and the Ecuador that I saw about 13 years ago was an entirely different country than the Ecuador that I came to visit, last week. It was entirely different. Things have really changed. When I went to Ecuador at the age of 12, we arrived at about my father and I, we arrived in Ecuador at about 2 in the morning. And when we got off the plane, as we walked out, there was like a space between the entrance to the airport and the street. And outside of the airport, in this space and the sidewalk, this was 2 in the morning. There was a crowd of thousands and thousands of people who would come there all the time, begging for anything. And there was a group of cops whose job it was to keep all the starving people away from the tourists. So I remember that. At 12 years old, walking out, seeing this crowd of starving people, and just having the cops push everyone back. I remember as a youth, we went, I got on the, when I was 12 years old, we went from site to site. We went to some historic churches in Quito, Ecuador, and everywhere we went, there was a crowd of starving, desperate people everywhere. Now, I didn't know this at the time, but at that time, Ecuador was suffering under what's been called neoliberalism. Now, this is a word we should all, as revolutionaries, understand. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the capitalist, imperialist class of the United States felt as if they had no opposition. There was no one who could challenge them. And so in Asia, and Africa, and Latin America, they said, we're going to go for it all. One of the most famous examples is, they set up these institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. And in countries all throughout Latin America, Africa, and Asia, they forced people to just give up everything, just take everything. And of course, they justified it. They had a lot of rhetoric, Milton Friedman and all of them. If we just introduce this complete free market capitalism, it's going to bring prosperity. But the results were mass suffering. Famously in Bolivia, they privatized the water resources. They sold the water resources to U.S. corporations. They made it a crime for people to even collect water on their roof, because if you collected rainwater on your roof, they said that was stealing from Nestle and Coca-Cola, and people were jailed for collecting rainwater on their roof. And in Ecuador, probably the most extreme example of what was done was that the Ecuador for a long time, just like many countries around the world, had its own currency. It had the Ecuadorian dollar. Well, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organization said, you don't have the right to have that anymore. And so now, today, as a result of the policies of neoliberalism and imperialism, even today in Ecuador, people carry around the bills they carry around in their pocket. They don't have people from Ecuador on the bills. They have George Washington. They carry down the same same currency we have. And when they switched to the U.S. dollar, when they forced the people of Ecuador to switch to the U.S. dollar, it wrecked their economy. And that's when I was there 13 years ago, just after their economy had completely wrecked. Indigenous people were thrown off their land. There was mass starvation and hunger. And as Marxists, we understand that nothing is permanent, and that oppression breeds resistance. And all over Latin America, this neoliberalism, this go for the kill that the capitalists and the imperialists had kind of forced on, it bred a fight back. And the Cubans, the Cuban government, the revolutionary socialist government of Cuba had a key role in that fight back. They had conferences against neoliberalism. And in Ecuador, one of the great victories was in 2006. You know, in 2006, a president was elected, President Rafael Correa, who identified with the movement and the uprisings and the protests and the strikes against neoliberalism. And Rafael Correa was elected. And, you know, it's important that when we talk about Latin America, we don't, you know, we have to keep in mind these countries were not always poor. You know, that's one of the myths we always hear, is that, these countries have always been poor, they've always been suffering. Latin America, especially Ecuador, was a center of the Incas, a vibrant, powerful, rich civilization that was destroyed by Spanish imperialism and colonialism. We have to keep that in mind. But these countries, they've been exploited, and President Correa took office, and you know, his election was essentially a referendum on imperialism. That's what people were voting on. It was, you could vote for the candidates who'd supported the policies of the international banks and neoliberalism, or you could vote for Correa, someone who identified with the protest movement. Now, Correa has taken office, and he says his goal is to take Ecuador to socialism. But we know socialism is a word that has a lot of different definitions to a lot of different people. The government of Ecuador at this point is a coalition government. It includes a lot of social democrats, people who think that gradually we're going to fix up capitalism and eventually it'll become socialism. It also includes communists, people like us who want to overturn this capitalist system and build a new world. And it also includes a lot of capitalists, because think about it. You know, the capitalists of Ecuador are being just pummeled and defeated by the imperialists. And if they want to stand up for themselves and fight against the imperialist capitalists of the United States, the only choice they have is to enter a coalition. To enter a coalition with the working class and the oppressed in Ecuador. So that's the situation. It's a coalition government. Their goal is to lead to socialism, but, you know, will they do it? We don't know. It's a process that's going on in Ecuador. It's a process. And it's not enough simply to point out that Ecuador is still a capitalist country, because it is. Because something's happening there. Something's happening in Ecuador and also in Bolivia, also in Venezuela. Things are happening. Conditions are changing, and we need to pay attention to it. As Marxists, we're scientists. You know, we're studying the world. We're studying things as they change and develop. We can't just, you know, it's not like there's some holy book that says on the 5th day thou shalt seize this bank. It doesn't work that way. You know, we're scientifically analyzing, and something's really happening. While we were in Ecuador, one of the things we saw was that, you know, there's free dental care. Now think about this. Here in the United States, the dental care is being cut. You know, even the highest paid workers don't get dental benefits anymore. This is part of the cutbacks that are going on. But in Ecuador, if you're an ordinary working class person, you can get in line. They have these tents set up, and when it's your turn, you go in and they give you free dental care, no questions asked. That's one thing that's going on. In Ecuador, the Cubans, they've had an arrangement that the Cubans have set up healthcare clinics in which Cuban doctors are there providing free health care to the people. One of the things we also saw is, you know, crime is a big problem in Ecuador. And one thing we saw is that the government provides free martial arts and self-defense training to all the youth. And so in the morning, at the park where the World Festival of Youth and Students were, you know, there would be the young people, and they'd be doing their, you know, karate and learning how to defend themselves, and they'd be wearing uniforms with the flag of Ecuador on it. And, you know, I was able to interview, and there's a video on YouTube you can watch of one of the instructors explaining how, you know, self-defense is part of the Bolivarian process, and how this is one of the great reforms that President Correa has brought about, is the free martial arts classes for the youth. When I was in Ecuador, things had really changed from when I was there as a child. I mean, the streets are paved, you know. There was homelessness, there was poverty, but it was nothing like the Ecuador I saw 13 years ago. And it's not just because of these popular reforms that that's come about. It's important to keep in mind that, you know, when the imperialists, when the U.S. imperialists, the British imperialists, the German imperialists, when they trade with a country, the result is impoverishment of the country. It's an exploitive relationship. But now with Correa, an anti-imperialist leader, now they're trading with China, and they're trading with Russia, and they're trading with Iran. And these are trades in which the colonized and oppressed countries of the world are trading with each other. And it's not an exploitive relationship. There's a new kind of global market developing of oppressed countries trading with oppressed countries, no longer being forced to trade with the imperialists. And that has resulted in a lot of economic development. And that's part of what's going on as well. One thing to keep in mind about the Bolivarian process in Latin America is that it's highly inspired by the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution is very key in it. They're paying very close attention to what the Cubans are doing, and that's kind of guiding them. And so, we don't know where the Bolivarian process is going to end up. We know that there are a lot of different class forces involved, a lot of political forces. We don't know where it's going to end up, but it's a very exciting thing. And it's improving the lives of working people in Ecuador, and that's very, very clear. And, after President Correa was elected, in 2009, the police worked with the CIA, and they tried to overthrow him. He was kidnapped by the police. And all the workers and the people poured out into the streets to protect President Correa. And there was an uprising of the people to defend their president, who identified with their anti-imperialist protest and their movement, and they defended him. And they were defending something. They were defending something. They were defending a government that tries its hardest, is moving to break the chains of imperialism. And that was very, very significant, and that's important to point out. So this festival we attended, the World Festival of Youth and Students, the first, they have them every 4 years. The first World Festival of Youth and Students was held in 1947. And it was held in Prague in Czechoslovakia. And it was communist youth from all over the world gathered in Prague. And they gathered, and they founded an organization called the World Federation of Democratic Youth. Now, it's important to point out, these were all communists. It was the Young Communist League of the United States, the Young Communist League of the Soviet Union. It was all communists, but they gathered and they called their federation the World Federation of Democratic Youth. You think, why didn't they call it the World Federation of Communist Youth? Well, that was a different time. 1947 was very different than the United States. And nowadays we hear a lot of nonsense. You go to school, you turn on the TV, people tell you that communism and fascism are the same thing. 1947 people didn't think that. Why? Because the communists had been known as the most militant and revolutionary anti-fascist fighters. And the capitalists of the world had loved Hitler. The King of England was actually forced to resign because he'd been so sympathetic to the Nazis. Henry Ford, a very prominent capitalist here in the United States, he would give away pro-Nazi literature with every car. Hitler had given him the Iron Cross. Coca-Cola, there's Fanta Orange and there's Coca-Cola. Well, the reason there's Fanta Orange was that was the drink that the Coca-Cola sold to the Nazis, had a business relationship with them. And when the Soviet Union, marched into Berlin, when they unfurled the hammer and sickle flag over Berlin, when they defeated the Nazis, everyone knew that it was the communists that were the anti-fascists. Even in Germany, where the communists had been it was totally illegal to be a communist. The communists functioned as an underground group, and they would get jobs. They would get jobs in the defense, not defense, but the armaments industries. And they would make sure that some of the shells got garlic or something like that poured into them instead of gunpowder. They would do everything. And right after the Second World War, the Communist Party of Britain, the Communist Party of France, the Communist Party of Germany, they were growing by leaps and bounds because people knew that the capitalists of the world had supported fascism, and that it was the communists who had been the real anti-fascist fighters. And everyone knew that. And that's why, at that time, they called this international grouping of communist youth, they called it the World Democratic Youth Federation. And every 4 years they would have these great big festivals, and often it was in a country that was building socialism. At that time, Czechoslovakia was building socialism. They've had them in Pyongyang and Moscow and elsewhere. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, they stopped having them for a little while. But it was the Cubans in 1997 that revived the World Festival of Youth and Students very historically with a call. And they said, we got to keep this going. We're not going to surrender. The imperialists with their neoliberalism and all that, they think they've triumphed, but communism needs to fight back. We need to be on the march. And they convened a World Festival of Youth and Students in 1997. It's been going ever since. One of the most exciting parts of the trip was when we met with youth from socialist countries. We had meetings with the Cuban youth, with the youth from Vietnam, with the youth from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And I mean, some of those meetings, you heard some really inspiring things. I know at the meeting between the U.S. delegation and the Young Communist League of Cuba, I know somebody asked, they said, what's the conditions for, what are the conditions for the youth in Cuba, the homeless youth, they asked, what are their conditions? And they said, there are no homeless youth in Cuba. We have a government that works very hard to provide housing for everybody, and especially the youth. The future of the revolution would never be allowed to be homeless. we had a conversation about LGBT rights and the struggle for women's liberation in Cuba, and they were very frank with us. They said, there are some Cubans that still have the patriarchal idea, this idea that the man is the head of a family or something like that. That's something we struggle against. They talk about how they have ad campaigns promoting LGBT equality. They talked about how if there's a family and their youth comes out as LGBT and the parents are not being accepting, the Young Communist League will intervene on behalf of that youth and work with the family to be more accepting of their child. Very exciting. One thing that, and it was interesting because we asked them what socialism was like in Cuba, but it was interesting because they had a lot of questions for us. They wanted to know about schools in the United States. And when we told them that in the United States, in the schools, there are actually cops walking through the halls, arresting people, they were just horrified. They said, how could that be, to have police in schools arresting people? They were very, very horrified that existed. And one of the major tasks that they communicated to us was the task of the Young Communist League of Cuba is winning young people in Cuba to support the revolution. And they said that one of the big mistakes that was made in the former Soviet Union was that the young people weren't reading Marx and Lenin in school. They were instead just reading textbooks, and that they weren't really engaging with the ideas. They were simply kind of just repeating what was told to them. And they said that in Cuban schools today, the youth, they not only read Marx and Lenin and Che and Fidel, they also read the writings of Abraham Lincoln and of Kennedy. And that they work really hard to win the young people to see the path that Cuba has taken and ask them to actively engage with revolutionary politics and revolutionary ideas, because at some point they will be leaders of the revolution, and that it's important to unleash young people as leaders and revolutionaries. That was one point they made to us. Now, we met with the Kim Il-sung youth of the DPRK, and it's really one thing that was really the DPRK. They really were kind of the stars of the whole festival. I mean, they did these musical performances. They had like singing quartets who got up on the stage, and not only did they sing Korean music, they sang Guantanamera, song of the Cuban Revolution. They sang Latin American revolutionary songs. They were just full of energy, and they wore suits and ties the whole time. They were very formal, and when they were reading statements, they were very formal. But when they were relaxed, you could see that these were the happiest people ever. They were just so affectionate to one another. It was just so happy to be with the Koreans. And when we met with them, I remember they told us, they said, we have hatred for what they called the fascist government of the United States, but we have no hatred for ordinary working people here in the United States. We want ordinary working people in the United States to see that we're allies. And they met with us. They said to us, you are our comrades now, which I thought was a very, very touching statement. One of the most interesting meetings we went to was actually a reception we were invited to by the Ho Chi Minh Communist Youth Union of Vietnam. And we went to it. We were invited as Youth from Workers' World Party and FIST, and it was a very, very interesting meeting. They gave a presentation in which they talked about how Vietnam, it'll take over 300 years, probably, 300 years to repair all the damage done by the U.S. imperialists in terms of landmines, in terms of chemical agents that were sprayed on the country. And one thing that they said to us very frankly is they said, we're not a socialist society at this time, but we'd like to become one. They said, we're moving in that direction. We'd like to become socialist, but they said, we have to have the market forces. But, and they talked about how they have programs there and how they provide, they're not in a position to provide free health care to everyone, but that's what they want to do. And at this point, they only provide free health care to all children. How they've taken measures, they've eliminated illiteracy, and how they're really struggling to build socialism in Vietnam. And Comrade Bao Han was very key in that meeting, because Comrade Bao Han speaks Vietnamese and was able to speak to them and give a message of solidarity. And we talked about how we feel one of our jobs, one of our demands as communists in the U.S. is to demand that reparations be paid to the Vietnamese people, because millions and millions of Vietnamese people were killed by the U.S. government during that war, and that they need reparations. Now, we met with so many different youth from so many different countries, and one of the beautiful things that was that we were able to compare notes. We met with the Communist Party of Mexico, the Communist Party of Brazil youth, and in Brazil they've recently had a round of uprisings, an upsurge, in response to the transportation cuts. There's cuts. The price of transportation is going up, of public transportation, and so all of a sudden they said it was just like out of nowhere. All these people were in the streets fighting back, fighting against capitalism. And we had similar conversations with youth, and everywhere it'll be like everything's just going on normal, and then all of a sudden people are protesting. It kind of reminds you of Occupy Wall Street. Where did that come from? It just kind of came out of nowhere. But one point that I think every youth delegation that was in a capitalist country made was that a lot of these rebellions are happening. People go out into the streets, all of a sudden they're fighting the police. But in so many cases, you know, it just goes away, you know, and that you know, these rebellions, they can't just be a place for youth to blow off steam and then go back to their low-wage jobs or go back to unemployment. These rebellions have to be fighting for something. They have to have a purpose. They have to have a destiny. And in order to do that, you know, they need Marxist-Leninist ideology. They need communism. And it's a big struggle, is how do you bring communism to the fighting youth movement? Because youth all over the world want to fight back against capitalism, but how do you give them something to fight for, not just something to fight against? That's a question that, I mean, all these communist youth were wrangling with. You know, and it was interesting because we met with some youth from Britain, the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist. Their youth group is called Red Youth. We met with them, and they said that you know, that all over Britain there are young people who see them on the internet and read about them. But it's a kind of a question: how do you plug people into the work? You know, especially if they're somewhere far away from any other communist grouping. We met with the Revolutionary Communist Group, another grouping in Britain, and I know they're experiencing very extreme police repression right now. You know, one of their youth was just simply selling a newspaper, and the police attacked him, and now he was convicted for assault on a police officer. And one thing we've noticed is that everywhere there is a crackdown. There's a big, huge, heavy police presence. It's because the capitalists of the world know what's coming. They can see what's coming, and they can see the people of the world are angry, and they're ready to fight back. A lot of exciting meetings went on. So many to talk about. But one thing that I did, you know, just really got to me while I was there is that, you know, we're from the United States, and this is a country that has killed millions and millions and millions of people all over the world. It's a country that has bombed and destroyed and murdered so many people, especially people fighting for socialism and fighting to break out of this system of imperialism. But people didn't spit on us. They weren't hostile to us. They embraced us, you know. They were so happy that there were youth in the United States who had communist views and were thinking about Marxism and thinking about trying to change it. And it just struck me about how important our task is here in the center of imperialism, how important it is that we strive very hard. I know we go out, and a lot of times, you know, it's a small rally. There might be 4 or 5 of us with a sign, but it occurred to me, and I do know now that I was there, there's 15,000 people that are there with us. You know, it's these youth. They were there with us, you know, and they're depending on what we're doing. And they're very carefully listening to everything we do. We may be small, communism may be small in the United States, but the communists of the United States have an exceptionally important role to play. We met with the Syrian delegation from Syria. And some of the folks on the U.S. delegation didn't want us to meet with the Syrians, but we met with them anyhow. And the Syrians, you know, they're under extreme attack, you know, under threat. I know there was a huge delegations from Angola and from Namibia, from countries that have been fighting for independence from imperialism. And Comrade Danielle was very key because you know, she's of Ghanaian heritage, from Ghana, and she was able to speak with them, and that was very important. The whole festival was actually dedicated to the memory of Nelson Mandela, the great anti-imperialist fighter against imperialism. And that was very important. And I guess I want to end by talking about something that happened, because during the opening march of the parade, you know, they have every country march, right? It's the parade, you know, the youth from every single country march. And, you know, our delegation from the U.S., there was only 30 from the U.S., only 5 of us from FIST and Workers' World Party. But, you know, a lot of these countries had hundreds of people. Angola, hundreds of people. Namibia, hundreds of people. Cuba, hundreds of people. But, you know, we were a small delegation, and I know that when we marched, they gave us a U.S. flag, you know, to be the symbol of our delegation. So, you know, we carried this U.S. flag, and when we got towards the end, where all the people were in the stadiums all watching, we took that U.S. flag and we ripped it up. And we ripped it up. We ripped it to shreds, and we got huge applause from the crowd. I mean, you wouldn't believe. They were so happy to see us ripping up this U.S. flag. And, you know, it was weird. Not everyone else on the U.S. delegation was too happy with us for doing that, but the people of the world were quite happy about it. And I remember Comrade Colleen was very bold in making the point to them. She said, the only people upset about this are the other people from the United States. Look, the people of the world are happy about this. And it was quite an exciting festival. And so many meetings went on, so many youth, you know, struggling against imperialism. Very exciting. And, you know, it really made me think, you know, the amount of affection we received, the amount of support we received, the amount of meetings where we learned so much, the amount of insight we were able to get from various communist youth groups from around the world. You know, I'm still processing it all. You know, this is a little quick to give a report. They say, you know, it takes you a long time to process things. So, you know, we're going to have a lot of reports and conversations about what went on the trip, but we learned a lot, and it just made me think, when we ripped up that U.S. flag, to think about, what would a world be like without all the things that quote-unquote America or the United States has come to represent? What would the world be like without military bases all over the world? What would the world be like without this country with a huge prison system with cops? What would this world be like without U.S. imperialism on the world, on the face of the earth? That's something we should all be thinking about, because that's what the people of the world, the youth all over the world, are thinking about. This is an exciting time we live in. There is a block of countries that are mobilizing to fight against imperialism. The imperialist system is doomed. It's collapsing of its own contradictions, of this crisis of overproduction, and there are thousands and thousands of youth who are actively fighting against it. I came back from Ecuador very inspired, very excited to go out and do what we keep doing, going to the youth saying, you have the right to a job, you have the right to an education, and the reason you don't have it is because of the billionaire capitalist class in this country, and there's a global movement, millions of people that are ready to fight back, to oppose it, and to bring this system down. It was a very exciting trip. I wish you all could have come with me, and the next one's going to happen in 2017, and that'll be the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. So my goal is I want to bring a delegation that's about 5 times the size of the delegation we brought this year. I want to recruit youth in the United States to fight against capitalism and imperialism and go to the next World Festival of Youth and rip up another U.S. flag. That was probably the most educational part of the conference, was hearing, the struggles that the countries that are trying to build socialism are going through, right? Now, if we as Marxists, we look at human history, right? You start out with the majority of human history, people are hunter-gatherers, there aren't any classes, but eventually, you get, private property is developed, eventually you have feudalism, and out of feudalism, you have the capitalist class that arises, is produced by the feudalists, and then overthrows them and becomes the ruling class, and now the capitalist class has produced the working class, and the working class, we're the grave diggers of capitalism, and we're eventually going to overthrow and overturn the capitalist class, create socialism, and eventually communism, right? That's how history works. It's like a train speeding forward. But this is a process. It's never been isolated in one country. It's never been just like, just one country, has feudalism, one country has capitalism, one country has socialism, communism. It just doesn't work that way. This is a global thing. And the question is begged: what do you do when there's a global capitalist system, a global capitalist economy, and you take power, but you only take power in a very small country like Cuba or Korea or Vietnam or China? I mean, even China's a huge country, but it's still part of this global capitalist system. So what do you do? And that's a question. And it's what all these countries that are building socialism are wrangling with. And like Sarah brought up with Lenin, with the new economic policy. Right after the Bolshevik Revolution, Russia was a very, very impoverished country. The surrounding countries that made up the Soviet Union, all the different nationalities, it was a very impoverished country, and they had to have capitalism. And Lenin said, this isn't state capitalism, this is capitalism we have here. It's led by a revolutionary party, but we have to allow, capitalism to take place. And this capitalism is going to take place, and we're going to tax these capitalists, and we're going to highly control them. We're going to make sure that the workers are protected. We're going to allow this capitalism to build up and develop, so then we can use capitalism to then build and centralize, and we saw that in the Soviet Union. The results, and finally then in 1928, after the new economic policy was finished, they began the 5-year plans, and they constructed socialism in the USSR, and you saw, a booming world economy. You saw it was probably the most rapid industrialization of any society in history. When the 5-year plans, when the Soviet Union became a world industrial power, producing more tractors than the United States, more steel than any other country in history. It was a booming world economy, and the rest of the world was having a Great Depression. It's funny, they don't tell you that. They talk about the Great Depression like it was a world depression, but the fact that there were thousands and thousands of U.S. workers who couldn't get work, who lined up outside the Soviet consulates and missions to try and get work in the USSR because they had a labor shortage. There was so much work to be done in the USSR, and that's a fact people don't talk about. But that's the question. We did meet, to answer the question, we did meet with folks from the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. There was also something called the Communist Party of the Soviet Union that was there. There were probably, I think, 3 to 5 different organizations. And as far as what's going on in the Ukraine is, this is a classic example. I mean, Ukraine, for whatever reason, Ukraine, the officials, the leadership of the Ukraine, was saying that they would rather align with Russia, rather align with Belarus and other countries, and not join the European Union, which is an imperialist body. And every country that's joined the European Union has resulted in the life expectancy and the standard of living of the workers going down. Whether it's even Britain, British workers have been hurt by the European Union, France, everywhere workers are hurt. The European Union is a racket. It's something the imperialists do. But, the imperialists very much wanted Ukraine to join the European Union. So, if you turn on CNN, you would think that there's some kind of glorious uprising of the people, against this evil government in the Ukraine. They just want the European Union so bad. But that's not true. That's not what's actually going on the ground. This is a coup. This is an imperialist coup. They overturned, and they're trying to force the Ukraine to join the European Union, mainly because the Russian government at this time is playing an anti-imperialist role. It's anti-U.S. It's trading with China and with Iran and with Ecuador and countries that are independent, and they want Ukraine under the dominion of the U.S. bankers and the U.S. imperialists and the U.S. capitalists. They don't want it pursuing a course of independent economic development, and that's what's happening there. And in order to do that, they know that some of the most militant anti-imperialist fighters in the Ukraine are, of course, who? The communists. And so what's going on now is you're seeing communists all across Ukraine are being rounded up and killed. And it's awful, and they're and this is something that's happened so often. The media, is whipping people up about some glorious revolution. But if this quote unquote glorious revolution that CNN and Fox News and all these capitalist media is talking about, but if it's in a country that happens to oppose the United States and you should be really suspicious, and that's kind of our understanding, and that's what the Ukrainians and the Russians told us about what was happening there, was that this was not a revolt of the people, this was a revolt fomented by the imperialists. And it's really interesting because we went to a presentation by the Cubans. The Cubans gave a presentation in which there was a Cuban leader named Capote, and he spoke, and his job, he has just written a book, and it will be published soon. What he spoke about was how he had infiltrated the CIA in Cuba. And this presentation he gave was really powerful, and I really hope, and we had some video of it, but I hope the book is available and we can get it out here and sell as many copies of this book as possible, because he talked about, this guy Capote was a Cuban, talked about infiltrating the CIA in Cuba. And they talked about how, there was this whole plan that the CIA had in Cuba where they were going to invent a dissident section in the Cuban Communist Party that was for socialism but against Fidel. And then they were going to fake that this section of the Cuban Communist Party was going to be persecuted. And then the U.S. was going to have to intervene to rescue this independent section. And they had this whole plan worked out. And Capote, when he spoke to this crowd, he said, this is the plan. This is exactly what they did in Syria. This is exactly what they did in Libya. And the only reason they didn't carry it out in Cuba is because the Cubans had infiltrated and exposed it and got it out before they were able to carry it out. But, they've discovered, when Bush invaded Iraq, he just got up there and said, we're sending the troops in and we're invading. And that was quite unpopular. And it caused this kind of outrage around the world. And that there is this method, and they've used it for years, where they kind of fake. They fake it. They fake an uprising or something. Or, these are methods that they use. And the Cubans' presentation was very, very powerful when they talked about how media is so key in revolt. And I think that's another thing that came out of so many of the meetings that we had, was about how, the means of communication. For so long, the television, right? TV media is owned; it's private property. MSNBC, they're kind of liberals, I guess. They're supposed to be liberals, but who owns them is General Electric. Who's General Electric? Is the biggest military contractor ever. No one makes more money from war than General Electric. So, even MSNBC, you want to believe what they say when about Libya, about any country, about Syria, you know who they're working for. But now with, the capitalists, they developed. It was the capitalist military that invented the Internet. It was the Pentagon that invented the Internet to further their communications so they could beat down the people of the world and develop their strategies. But now the Internet is something that they don't control. All over the Internet, there's progressive forces. There are people utilizing the Internet to expose them. Videos of police brutality are all over YouTube. You can see what the U.S. cops are all about. And it's a very frightening thing, is that the Internet is beyond their control. And one important thing about Ecuador is that the role that they've played for Julian Assange. Right? Julian Assange is in the Ecuadorian consulate in Britain. All right, and that's something to point out now. The imperialists, they've developed technology, they've developed all this, but they don't control it. And you look back at the revolutions that happened in the past. The printing press and all of that developed in Europe. It was developed and it was eventually used to bring down the feudal class. Despite they're the ones that invented it. They invented it to print their Bibles and their indulgences, and then it was used to overthrow them. And this is what Marx has always talked about. The old system created creating the seeds of its own destruction. And this is the reality. We're seeing the laws of Marxism unfold before us every day, and that's why there were three different tendencies. I won't name any of them, well, other than us, who was on this delegation, and we have different views as parties. Different Marxist tendencies are going to have different views, but it was so important, for people to just kind of dismiss Ecuador and just say, oh, it's not a socialist country. That's not enough. It's not enough. You're not doing your job as a Marxist. Socialist, capitalist. That's too easy. You're not doing your job, right? Because something's happening in Ecuador, something's happening in Bolivia, something's happening in Venezuela, and we have to be paying attention to this. And we always have to be going back to the drawing board and studying, because if we're going to make a revolution in this country, right, which is going to be a really difficult task. I mean, if we're going to make a revolution in this country, we have to constantly be questioning everything we do, constantly changing our methods, constantly figuring out new ways to get the working class in motion and doing what we're going to do. And that's something we have to wrangle with. Lenin said that if the conditions change in 24 hours, the activities of the Revolutionary Party must also change in 24 hours, right? We have to constantly be struggling and figuring out how we can do it. We need new methods and new approaches, new tactics, new propaganda, new agitation, different ways to approach the workers. This is something that revolutionaries are doing. They're doing it all over the world. The communist youth groups we met with, they're all doing this stuff. They're wrangling with the very same questions that we're wrangling with. So that's why the festival was important. That's why, the Vietnamese, the Cubans, that's why they were all so excited to meet us. Why? Because we're in the center of imperialism. Because until imperialism is brought down, these socialist countries are always going to face extreme difficulty. To really see socialism blossom into what it's meant to be, into a society with jobs and schools and education, and then moving toward communism. Communism, the higher stage, where we don't even need a government. We don't even need a state, because there's such a material abundance. To move in that direction is going to require imperialism to be eradicated. And we're in the center of imperialism, and we have a very, very important task to do. So that's what I want to end with. Thank you.